I've spent the past month traveling around Australia, raising the money, trying to raise the money that we need to refuel our ships, to once again head down to Antarctica to shut down the Japanese whaling fleet. My travels have brought me from Brisbane to Adelaide, even to the goldfields of Kalgoorlie. And the one talk that probably stands out above any other talk is one that I gave in Brighton Harbour, just 30 kilometers south of Adelaide. I was addressing a group a little bit bigger than this one, but it was 500 people, and it was 500 six-year-old kids at a primary school. And as I was preparing for this talk, I thought, how do I explain an issue as complicated as whaling to a group of six-year-old kids? And then I realized, it's really not that complicated when you get down to the nuts and bolts. And as I stood there in front of these kids, I said, look, in this sad and cruel world that we live in, there are bad people that want to hurt whales. There are good people out there that want to save whales. We are the good people that want to save whales, and all of the kids got it. Eight months ago, the Sea Shepherd fleet returned to Williamstown, Victoria, having successfully saved the lives of 932 whales. Around the same time, the Japanese whaling fleet returned back to Tokyo, Japan, with just 9% of their self-allocated quota. It was the most successful Antarctic Whale Defence Campaign that Sea Shepherd has ever had, and it was the absolute worst whaling season that the Japanese whaling fleet in their entire whaling history had ever experienced. When the Japanese whaling fleet returned back to Japan, they blamed their record low hunt on Sea Shepherd's direct interventions. They called those interventions relentless. And that's why we've gone ahead and we're calling our next campaign just that, Operation Relentless. I've served with Captain Paul Watson for 10 years now. And in that time, I've learned a great number of things. But the most important lesson that I've learned is that success is achieved by undying, unwavering persistence and never believing, not even for one single moment, that our goals are unachievable. Since we're going into our 10th Antarctic Whale Defense Campaign, I thought I would start by talking a little bit about what it means to be relentless, what it means to be persistent. And because of that, I want to go back in time a little bit. Sea Shepherd was founded in 1977 by Captain Paul Watson, and the first campaign that Sea Shepherd ever undertook was not to save whales, but to stop the brutal slaughter of seals in Canada. In 1977, 320,000 of these baby harp seals, these 4 to 6 week old seal pups, were being clubbed to death on the ice floes of Canada every single year simply for their furs. The first campaign that Sea Shepherd did was to take a ship up to those ice floes, to go out onto the ice, and to spray paint these seals red, thereby rendering their pelts commercially valueless. Those campaigns continued for quite a while, and because of that, the Canadian government decided that enough was enough, and they passed this draconian set of laws called the Seal Protection Act. Now, what the Seal Protection Act was, it was really the Sealer Protection Act, and it made it unlawful for anybody to come within half a nautical mile of the seal hunt, because ultimately what the government of Canada did not want was for news to get out about the fact that 68% of these seals were being skinned while still alive. 2008 was a turning point for the campaign. We'd been campaigning on the issue for 31 years. In 2008, the European Parliament was considering a ban on the importation of all seal products into the European Union. But to get the Parliament to vote it through, what we needed was a lot of attention on the issue. We needed the media behind us, and Sea Shepherd is very, very good at getting that kind of publicity. I was in Bermuda with Captain Paul Watson. We were sitting at a bar in Hamilton, And I sat there with him and I said, look, Paul, what do you want to do? What's the plan for this campaign? And Paul said, well, we need to get maximum publicity, and I think the best way to do it is to get the ship arrested. So I said, okay, well, that sounds like a good plan, but how do you recommend we go about achieving this? I mean, I get it in principle. And Paul thought about it for a little bit, and he said, okay, well, you know, in my experience, 90% of success is just showing up, so just bring the vessel up to Canada and see what happens. So I said, okay, well, that's fair enough. We're going to get some footage, but to get that footage, we're going to have to come within half a mile. We don't have one of these impossible-to-get seal observation licenses that I'd been denied year after year. So sooner or later, we're going to get some Canadian Coast Guard vessel radioing us and telling us that we have to keep half a nautical mile away. So what do you want us to do then? So Captain Paul Watson thought about that, and he said, well, why don't you tell them like in those Western movies, how they say, we don't need no stinking badges. When they tell you that you don't have a permit, tell them, we don't need no stinking permits. 4 days later, we were in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. We were circling a seal killer boat. We were so close to these sealers that the ice was practically breaking underneath their feet. Our cameras were rolling. These sealing barbarians retreated to their boat, and the seals right there on the ice, they were safe. Lo and behold, that radio conversation came across. It wasn't just from one Canadian Coast Guard vessel, though. There were 2 Canadian Coast Guard icebreakers. There was 1 destroyer vessel from the Canadian Navy. There were 2 Coast Guard helicopters. There was a surveillance plane from the Department of Fisheries, and there was a Navy plane circling ahead. In 2008, the Canadian government was taking the Seal Protection Act very, very seriously. Lo and behold, that call came ahead. Farley Mowat, which was our vessel at the time, this is the Canadian Coast Guard. You are instructed to keep half a nautical mile away. You do not have a valid seal observation permit. And so as I stood there on the bridge, I thought, what was it that Paul wanted me to say? And I grabbed the radio and said, Canadian Coast Guard, this is the Farley Mowat. We are a Dutch registered vessel. We have freedom of movement through these waters. To be frank, sir, we don't need no stinking permits. And so began the waiting game. There were 19 crew on board the vessel, and we had a tally board in the mess because we were taking bets to see how long it would take before the Coast Guard boarded the vessel. On the first day, we had 18 votes no, 1 vote yes. 2 days later, we had 5 votes yes, 18 votes no, or 14 votes no. My math's not so good. After 5 days, we had 18 votes yes, and my incredibly naive vote no. About half an hour after tallying those votes, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, mounted on rigid hull inflatable boats, seized the vessel at gunpoint. It took them about 5 minutes to do so. Captain Alex Cornelison and myself, I was his first officer, we were taken on to our respective interrogations by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Serious Crimes Unit. Like I said, the Seal Protection Act was a really big deal in 2008. We were interrogated under the naked light bulb for about 6 hours, during which time neither Alex nor myself said a word. I just looked at my feet. I wouldn't even acknowledge that they were in the room. After 6 hours, they had to let us go, and as they moved us over to the paddy wagon, Alex and I heard our interrogating officers talk about what they'd accomplished. I heard my interrogating officer say to Alex's arresting officer, he asked him, did Alex tell you anything? Did Cornelison give you anything during this interrogation? And Alex's arresting officer says, nope, didn't give me a word, didn't say anything. How about Hammarstedt? Did he tell you anything? He goes, nope. Hammarstedt just sat there in silence, wouldn't even acknowledge that I was in the room. And that's when Cornelius' interrogating officer lets out this deep, deep sigh and mutters under his breath, Jesus, these damn seal huggers are tougher to crack than the Hells Angels. Alex and I were subsequently deported from Canada. It was no great loss from us, although I have to explain to Australian Immigration and Customs what the Seal Protection Act is every year I come to Australia. Thankfully, Marie was my saving grace again this year. I went to the Immigration and Customs desk. Mr. Hammarstedt, we've seen you've been deported. What's the story? I've been deported from Canada. What's the offense? I filmed a seal being skinned alive. That's an offense? It is in Canada. And what happened? I was fined and deported. This sounds very strange to me. What are you doing in Australia, Mr. Hammarstedt? Well, I'm going to the New South Wales Parliament to address a group of our supporters with my friend Marie Ficarra, a member of the Legislative Council. Mr. Hammarstedt, you lead a very interesting life. Welcome to Australia. Alex and I were deported from Canada, but the amount of publicity generated by the arrest of our ship in Europe, it was a Dutch registered vessel, along with the work of other groups, of course, led to the European Parliament passing this ban. And overnight, the price per pelt of seal fell from $70 to $7, and the number of seals killed fell by 90%. For me, talking about the senseless cruelty of the Canadian seal hunt is a natural transition into talking about the insane violence that is the killing of whales in the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary. Every year around this time, a fleet of killer ships sets sail from Japan. They sail halfway around the world to the ends of the earth. They do so to kill 935 threatened and protected minke whales, 50 endangered fin whales, and 50 endangered humpback whales, the very same humpback whales that come up here to Australia to have their calves every winter. This fleet of killer ships does this despite the fact that since 1986 there has been a global ban on commercial whaling. They kill these whales even though they do so within the bounds of the Antarctic Treaty Zone. They kill these whales in a designated whale sanctuary. And they kill these whales in Australia's sovereign and economic waters, despite the fact that there is an Australian federal court order from 2008 banning the practice from taking place. I look at those realities and I recognize that we already have the law on our side. We already have the media on our side. We already have public opinion on our side. We have all of these things, and yet still this fleet of killer ships is intent on brutally slaughtering over 1,000 whales this summer. Well, when you get to that stage, if the Australian government isn't going to stop these poachers, then I don't see any other choice but for caring, compassionate people like us to go down there to the scene of the crime and to shut these criminals down ourselves. Operation Zero Tolerance, our previous Antarctic Whale Defence Campaign, was our most successful campaign to date. It evolved a little bit differently than previous Antarctic campaigns. Thanks to the support of all of you, we had a great event here in Sydney last year. Thanks to your support, we were able to add another Sea Shepherd vessel to the fleet, the Sam Simon. And thanks to the addition of the Sam Simon, we found the Japanese whaling fleet earlier than ever before. And we also located the Achilles heel of the Japanese whaling industry, namely their refueling tanker, Sun Laurel. About halfway through the campaign, our campaign strategy shifted to one where we realized that if we could prevent the Japanese whaling fleet from refueling, then we would force them to cut their whaling season short early. I remember sitting in my cabin and thinking, how are we going to go about achieving this? And as a plan came to fruition, I realized that because of how dangerous it would be, I would need to make sure to get all of my crew on board with me. I gathered all of the crew in the mess, and as I had them sitting there in front of me, I said, okay, here's the plan. Here's what we're looking at. If the Japanese whaling fleet refuels, they will resume their illegal hunt. If they do not, then the whaling fleet will have to go home and the whales will be safe. So here is what we are going to do. We have a 5,000-ton refueling tanker here. We have an 8,000-ton factory whaling ship there. What we are going to do is we're going to take our 500-ton vessel, we're going to put it right between the two. We're going to radio the captain of this factory ship, and we're going to tell him that if he wants to refuel, he's going to have to sink us to do it, and then we're going to see what happens. Are there any questions? And there were no questions. So I said, look, I completely understand. This is incredibly dangerous. If you want to disembark, we can move you over to one of the other Sea Shepherd vessels. I won't hold it against you. I had 34 crew on board my ship, half of whom were Australian. And out of 34 crew, every single member of my crew decided to stay on board and stand their ground against this factory whaling ship. Every single one of them. The day was February 21st, and it was clear that the Japanese whaling fleet was going to try to refuel. The Nisshin Maru, the factory whaling ship, was high out of the water, obviously low on fuel. The Sun Laurel, the refueling tanker, started putting their fenders, their big Yokohama fenders, in the water, ready for the Nisshin Maru to raft up. I quickened the pace of the bow barker. I pulled up alongside the tanker. I used my two thrusters to push into their fender. I then radioed the factory ship and I said, Nisshin Maru, this is the bow barker. If you want this fuel, you will have to run us through to do it. We will not move for you. I was pretty sure that the Nisshin Maru would back down then, but as I looked over my shoulder, I saw that they continued on their course and they weren't slowing down. The Nisshin Maru collided with their own refueling tanker 4 separate times before they made contact with the bow barker. And as they made contact with the bow barker, they tried to push us out of the way. And for me, standing at the helm, just trying to keep my vessel in place, it was difficult to really recognize and realize how close this 5-story tall building of a vessel really was to us. As I stood there holding my ground, I heard the unmistakable sound of my French second mate Una, who's always so calm and collected, say the words, uh-oh. And so I look over to Una, who's standing 3 meters to my right, and right there behind Una, 1 meter outside the bridge window, like a wrecking ball, is the anchor of this 8,000-ton factory whaling ship. The Nisshin Maru continued to push ahead, and as it did, from the bridge, we could hear the sound of twisted steel as the masts began to bend under the frayed prow of the bow of this ship. And as they kept pushing, the bow barker began to turn until we were completely perpendicular to the tanker. That's when we were most vulnerable. It was when the beam of the vessel, the side of the vessel, was completely exposed to the ship. And as we sat there exposed, the Nisshin Maru kept pushing ahead. We started listing over, first 10 degrees, then 15 degrees, and then finally we were listing over at 20 degrees, and as we were listing over, all of a sudden we lost power on the bridge as the frayed prow of the bow of this factory ship continued to destroy everything above the wheelhouse. It was at that time that I had no other choice but to put out a Mayday distress call. Mayday, 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 this is the bow barker, this is the bow barker. I have 34 souls on board. You are destroying us, you are destroying us. Back down, back down. And in probably the quickest response to a maritime distress call in maritime history, the Nisshin Maru went full astern and backed out of the situation. The Nisshin Maru would try to refuel one other time. It was February the 25th. Once again, we got in the way. Once again, we blocked them. And after a second unsuccessful refueling attempt, the Japanese whaling fleet realized that they wouldn't get any fuel that season. They made the decision to leave the Antarctic Treaty Zone, and they surrendered the whale sanctuary to us. The Nisshin Maru backed down because we put them in a position where the only way to stop us would have been to sink us. The Japanese whaling industry outmatches us in physical resources. There's no doubt about that. They have a lot of money backing them. But we have something that they do not have, and that is all of you. It's dedication, it's your passion, it's your commitment. It is something that they do not have. And as General Napoleon Bonaparte, the master war strategist himself, said, the moral is to the physical as 3 to 1, meaning that Napoleon chose to go into a battle with an army 1/3 the size of the opposing army anytime if that 1/3 had the willingness to fight. That's what we have that the whaling fleet does not have. On February 21st, when I stood my ground against this 8,000-ton factory whaling ship, I stood my ground because I knew that if Captain Paul Watson had been there at the helm of the Bob Barker, he would have stood his ground. I stood my ground because I knew that every single one of my crew, every single one of them, was ready and willing to stand their ground as well. We, my crew and I, stood our ground because we knew that all of you here would have wanted us to stand our ground. And when I stood up here on this stage last year, I made a promise and I said, if you give us the fuel we need to get down to Antarctica, if you give us that fuel, then I promise you that we will do everything that we can to shut these killing machines down. So when we stood our ground to live up to that promise. We stood our ground for Sydney, and we stood our ground for all of you as well. But most importantly, more importantly than anything else, when we stood our ground on February the 21st, we stood our ground because at that moment we were the only hope that these whales had of being spared the Harpoon. In 2008, I was Captain Paul Watson's first officer on board our flagship, the Steve Irwin, when a minke whale was harpooned 15 nautical miles away from our ship. This whale was killed too far away for us to directly intervene in her death, but our helicopter captured every agonizing second of her death. This was a pregnant female minke whale. She was in Australia's economic waters. She was harpooned twice. She was shot another 7 times by rifle fire. And from the time she was harpooned until the time she finally drowned in her own blood, it took 22 minutes and 40 agonizing seconds for her to die. When we stood our ground to prevent that. And I stand here on this same stage that I stood last year making you the same promise. Give us the fuel we need tonight, and I promise you that we will do everything that we can to shut these killing machines down. When you support us tonight, you are not just supporting an organization, Sea Shepherd. You are not just supporting our campaign, Operation Relentless. You are getting behind a movement, and you are getting behind a belief. And that belief is that when government fails in their obligation to represent the popular will of the people, in their desire to see the laws that we have in place to protect animals, to protect nature, are enforced, when government fails in that responsibility, then caring, compassionate people like us will take on that responsibility. Throughout history, evil has prevailed only when good people do nothing, but when you support us tonight, you are doing something, because every single whale that we will save in Antarctica, thanks to your help, is a victory. 50 years ago, there were 45 factory whaling ships in Antarctica at any one time, 45 of them. There is now only one remaining. It is a Japanese flagged floating abattoir that has no place in a whale sanctuary, let alone in this century. That is our target. I know what this organization, this movement is capable. I've seen what we were able to do to bring down the Canadian seal industry. I've seen us bring an industry to its knees. We won against the Canadian sealing industry because we were persistent, and tonight, with your support, I promise you that we can shut down whaling in the Southern Ocean, and we can do so because we are relentless. Thank you.